Good afternoon. I am Rochelle Williams, Project Director and co-PI for the ARC Network. And I would like to welcome all of you and thank the 115 of you that have registered for this second installment of the ARC Network webinar series. Before we begin, I would like to take care of a few housekeeping items. First, I want to let you know this webinar is being recorded and it will be made available to all registrants and will also be uploaded to the ARC Network online community platform. Also, we have placed everyone on mute and ask that if you have any questions, to please place them in the chat box, which can be accessed on the panel at the bottom of this screen. We will also address all questions at the conclusion of the speaker's presentation. Second, I would like to share a bit about the ARC Network and Virtual Visiting Scholars Program. The goal of the ARC Network is to create and cultivate broad community that bridges the gap between researchers and practitioners. As the STEM Equity Brain Trust, the ARC Network works to promote systemic change by collecting previous work and producing new perspectives, methods, and interventions. The ARC Network is funded by the National Science Foundation's Advanced Program, and the Association for Women in Science serves as the backbone organization. Through our Virtual Visiting Scholars Program, we focus on promoting and curating research on gender and STEM by funding meta-analysis on topics to synthesize existing gender equity research and data sets that have foundational literature and using that to develop ideas for research frontiers. We are grateful to our ARC Research Board members, led by ARC co-PI Joan Herbers, for their work overseeing the Virtual Visiting Scholars Program. To learn more about the ARC Network, we encourage you to visit equityinstem.org. Now the reason we're all here today. Today's session will be led by Dr. Ethel Mickey on her work titled Gender, Race, and Networks, Examining Career Implications for Faculty in STEM. Dr. Mickey is a sociologist studying gender, work and organizations, STEM and social networks, and is a visiting lecturer in the Department of Sociology at Wellesley College, where she teaches courses on gender, technology, and society, and the sociology of education. As a virtual visiting scholar, he has used this past year to explore the implications of STEM faculty networks for career success through an intersectional gender lens. Dr. Mickey, please take it away.
Great. Thank you, Rochelle, and thank you all for being here. Good afternoon. I'm happy to have the opportunity to discuss virtually to such a broad audience on a project I've been working on this past year. So as Rochelle mentioned, I'm a sociologist of gender and organizations, and my work really broadly focuses on the persistence of inequalities in knowledge-based industries, including STEM. So my doctoral work was on the high-tech industry, and I've also been involved in various projects looking at the careers of academics and STEM faculty. And so more specifically, I aim to identify the more subtle, interactive processes that perpetuate intersectional inequalities and forms of exclusion in STEM. So we all know discrimination is illegal, and organizations today widely reject bias and stereotyping. However, in the context of higher education, systems of marginalization and privilege along lines of gender, race, class, sexuality, age, are all persisting. So this can be evidenced by research showing that about 26% of tenured STEM faculty are women, and women of color make up only 2% of tenure track or tenured faculty in STEM. And in some fields like engineering or the physical sciences, it's still not uncommon, especially in R1 research-based institutions, to find one woman or none at all in departments. And women faculty who start as assistant professors in STEM are more likely to leave academia without tenure than men. And so one report warns that if the current rate of progress continues, it could take up to a century for women to achieve parity with men in university STEM faculty. So as a researcher, I see these data, these patterns, and I'm really driven to figure out what is going on in faculty careers. And I've chosen specifically to focus on social networks as a mechanism reproducing inequalities in STEM. So the project I'm discussing today is a meta-analysis of existing studies on this topic. And specifically, I'm conducting, or have been conducting, a qualitative meta-ethnography. And I'll go into more details as the talk goes on about what that really means. But through a systematic overview of previous research, I aim to identify gendered and racialized patterns in faculty networks, but in addition to that, to also begin to identify opportunities for institutional change. And so a goal of this research and this partnership with the ARC network is to begin to brainstorm interventions to work towards equity in higher education and in STEM fields more broadly. So to give away sort of the punchline right up front, my research reveals that networking is beneficial. Indeed, some studies find it's indispensable for success in academic careers. But that women, and especially women of color, remain marginalized in faculty networks even today. I will specifically describe 3 patterns that I observe in the research. So first, women tend to have smaller networks than their male counterparts. Women STEM faculty also tend to be more disconnected from the central actors in research networks as compared to men. And then finally, both men and women scientists tend to have gender and racially homophilous networks, meaning that their networks are made up of people similar to themselves. So for those of you, let me see here, that are interested in learning more about the ARC network, Rochelle has already briefly talked about it and pointed you to our website, equityinstem.org. And so to give you a brief sense of what today's talk will look like, I'll start by introducing some key areas of the research of theory that is framing this project, as well as my research questions. I'll briefly explain my methods and then discuss the findings and their implications. And so I look forward to hearing your discussion questions and having some feedback, which I'll ask you to hold to the end, as Rochelle mentioned. And so I've left about 20 minutes at the end of this webinar for discussion. If clarifying questions come up as I'm speaking, or if you just want to get your question out there while you think of it, you can enter it into the chat box, and Rochelle will be moderating at the end. Okay. So why did I choose to focus on networks? Why is it important that we study networks? And so let me start by asking you all a question. And so there is this feature on Zoom that we can have some interaction here. And so you should all have a raised hand function, either in your webinar control or maybe off on your sidebar. And so using this function on Zoom, if you could all please click the button and raise your hand if you've ever been told that you need to network or that you really should network as part of career advice that's been given to you. Okay, I'm seeing, good. Lots of raised hands. So it seems like most, yep, and they're still coming in, great. So most, if not all of you, have been told at one point or another that networks are valuable resources, tools for career success. And so we have folks in here from a variety of industries and contexts. So this is really a pervasive theme throughout our economy. And this is really true for academics. Social networks are a form of social capital. See here, here we go. A resource for individuals to locate opportunities, acquire information and skills, and gain support and legitimacy. And scientific and technical work especially relies on the cooperation of people, research teams and groups, who often are working across disciplines in research teams. So academic networks consist of informal relationships and mentoring, as well as more formal collaborations that could include co-authorship. They provide resources like lab space, equipment, funding opportunities, job information, and also implicit or tacit knowledge about the unwritten rules and informal expectations and norms of academia. But despite these theorized benefits of social capital, sociologists have long recognized that networks contribute to the production and maintenance of social stratification. So there's ever increasing evidence that marginalization and exclusion from networks in parts contributes to this underrepresentation of women and minorities in STEM and contributes to what's been called the chilly climate. So for example, women faculty tend to lack senior women colleagues to serve as role models and mentors, and they experience heightened cultural boundaries and exclusion from membership in elite groups of scientists. Now, some of you might be familiar with this term old boys club, which is the informal male-dominated networks that hoard opportunities and privileges for themselves, thereby institutionalizing men's dominance over women. And then just to show you some contemporary examples of how the old boys network plays out. I have some recent examples of the all-male panel, or what has been called MANL. So here's a 2018 campus event on women in math. Here we have the 2019 selection committee for the Fundamental Physics Breakthrough Award, which to me seems like a fairly large selection committee. And from my count, there's one woman there. And then finally, from the software company PayPal and their 2016 event on gender equality in the workplace. Again, we see all men here on this panel. So these might be extreme examples, but they're more pervasive than you would imagine. There's an entire Tumblr page dedicated to MANLs if you're really interested. But you start to see and get a sense that these social relational inequalities start to accumulate over careers. Exclusion from one panel could lead to exclusion on another, which could lead to exclusion on a research team or a grant opportunity. And so this really all builds to contribute to gendered and racialized patterns and forms of capital. So what am I doing? What's my project? As I'll discuss, studies consistently find that women in STEM, and especially women of color, remain marginalized in networks, even despite more institutionalized efforts that we're seeing surrounding diversity and inclusion. So I suggest then that the more complex and important question centers on how are women and men networking differently, what do their networks look like, how do they compare, through what network structures are women and minorities included? So question one really, are there intersectional gender differences in faculty networks? And then number two, what can we do about this, right? Can these patterns explain variations in faculty career outcomes? And then how do we move forward once we have identified these differences to begin to redesign or redevelop more inclusive forms of intervention? So next I want to briefly describe my research methods, or how I conducted this project, and then I'll move into some key findings. So as I said, this project is a qualitative meta-analysis of existing research on gender, race, and faculty networks. And so specifically, I employ thematic analysis and meta-ethnography. The aim of meta-analysis is to use and synthesize existing research knowledge to answer focused questions, to develop new insights and conclusions. And so a meta-analysis is especially appropriate for this topic because there has been quite an explosion of research on gender and networks across subfields, including sociology, but also in the field of social network studies, organizational behavior, and management. I know we have a number of folks here present in the webinar from different disciplines that are engaging in very similar questions. And so these subfields are looking at very similar questions and topics, but disciplinary silos in higher education often mean that relevant groups of research are not in conversation with each other. So this project therefore also serves to provide a much needed synthesis of these various literatures to integrate the conversations and research findings. I argue that understandings of gender inequality in academic STEM disciplines would be further strengthened through an integration of these subfields of research. So to briefly now describe the steps of this meta-analysis approach, I'm going to go over this rather quickly, and I'm happy to go over it in more detail if you all have questions in the discussion and if you're interested. And so this is a systematic qualitative synthesis method in which researchers select, analyze, and interpret studies to answer very focused questions on a specific topic to come up with new insights and conclusions. So I first cast a rather wide net using a comprehensive search strategy to systematically locate all studies eligible for inclusion using certain keywords and search criteria. And this yielded about 12,000 studies or records, which is way too many, right? Especially for a qualitative approach. But I think this large number is really important. It speaks to and demonstrates the point that I just made about the explosion of research here on this topic, and a lot of folks engaging in questions of networks. And so the goal with this qualitative approach is not to be exhaustive and include all 12,000 records, but to really be rigorous and focus on which research is offering the best conceptual insights for the questions that I have posed. So imagine, for those of you that have conducted literature reviews, This is really a comprehensive literature review of all of the research and literature on the topic. And here the quality and relevance of studies is more important than thinking about the quantity, although the quantity can provide us with some useful information. So then I screened articles to determine their relevance and quality. And so these studies are limited to those that are peer-reviewed, English language, and focused specifically on STEM faculty, gender, race, and networks. And so I include studies across disciplines, and I now have about 100 key papers that I've been working with, those that are most relevant to my central questions. And so then I proceeded with a two-step analysis. So the first step was this thematic analysis, which is really descriptive, which I summarized the collective and aggregate conclusions of the studies, starting to look for which themes are recurring, that are prominent, what's coming up again and again, and then moving into interpretive analysis, where I began to synthesize and translate studies into each other through a process called Reciprocal Translation. This is when you map key themes across studies and translate findings into each other to begin to build third order conclusions that are answering broader questions. And these two steps are quite iterative, and there would be, some reading and summarizing, and then some new insights would be found, and would cause me to sort of go back to step one. And so this is part of an inductive, sort of grounded theory approach that I was taking to this data analysis. And so in the remainder of this presentation, I will highlight some key findings from this project and then conclude with some remaining questions and next steps. So before I address my two central research questions, I want to briefly discuss a puzzle that I kept returning to in my analysis, and a puzzle that could make for an interesting discussion question for all of us today. The question is, what do we mean by network? How are networks defined or conceptualized in research, especially when trying to measure faculty networks and implications for their careers? And so I want you all, or invite you all, to think for a minute about your own professional network. Think of maybe the closest five to 10 folks who are in your professional network. Now, again, using the hand raise function, please click the button and raise your hand if your network that you are thinking of includes some current coworkers. Okay, great. How about a boss, a supervisor, or a mentor? Good, okay. How about former coworkers from previous jobs? Yep, we're seeing a lot of raised hands here, okay. How about collaborators or co-authors on a project? Okay. Friends? Nope, no one has any friends, it looks like. And then lastly, family. Okay. So you can see our networks are complicated, right? There are certain groups and different buckets of people that we're drawing on for different kinds of resources, information and advice that are all career related. So then as researchers, empirically, how do we go about capturing such a complex social concept? So I find that one of the results of the disciplinary silos of research is a definitional mismatch of faculty networks. So for example, faculty networks are measured by anything from co-authorship, research collaboration, self-reported friendship or mentorship ties, or involvement in working groups and teams. The most common approach amongst the key papers that I've included in this study is to have respondents, meaning the faculty themselves, identify their network members, often through surveys. So surveys, for example, may ask faculty to list people who are closest members of their professional network, including the names of mentors, advisors, postdoctoral supervisors, individuals with whom they discuss work-related issues, departmental colleagues, and so forth. So these are extensive surveys, but you'll see that there's a lot of room for flexibility and variation in terms of how individuals respond to these kinds of questions. Also, you'll see that these questions, these survey type measures of networks include instrumental ties, and these are links that involve the exchange of specific information or the transfer of knowledge, as well as expressive or effective ties, which include resources like advice, help, and trust. So instrumental ties are often directly related to producing scholarship, if we're thinking about faculty specifically, and include co-authors or relationships through financial support like grant funding. While expressive ties, we can imagine to provide resources like guidance on how to navigate professional interactions, how to navigate departmental culture, as well as that emotional social support that is really necessary for these high stress jobs. And so I'm sure some of you are still continuing to think about your own network ties and recognizing that some relationships that you have are both instrumental and expressive. And so we call these kinds of relationships multiplex. They are multi-layered, occurring between individuals who interact in multiple social contexts. So leaving the definition of networks and network ties open to respondents allows for this flexibility, but also there's some problems with this, right? So for example, we only hear from one side of the relationship in a network survey. There's a very good chance that this relationship might not be reciprocated or viewed similarly by the other member of the tie. Or people often forget about certain relationships when filling out surveys. They could have forgotten someone or left someone out. So there are many different ways to compare networks by gender and race. Studies look at everything from the quantity of ties, how many relationships does an individual have, to tie strength, to various forms of social capital and resources gained from ties. And so as of now, I've chosen to treat this definitional mismatch as an important finding from the meta-analysis in and of itself, as this lack of common language or shared tools in studying faculty networks may in fact be part of the reason why we struggle still to alleviate women's structural and cultural disadvantages. And so now let's think about some of the key findings from this project. Before I get into my findings, I want to just discuss briefly these different characteristics of networks that come up in the research. And so research on gender and networks that's often comparing men and women's networks tends to focus on the size, structure, and composition of faculty networks. So size, in terms of network size, it's typically measured by the number of connections an individual has or the number of other people they have relationships with. And we typically tend to see that larger networks provide individuals with greater access to other connections, to resources, and social capital. And so not only does the number of ties matter, but as I said, also the quality of these relationships matters as well, often measured by tie strength. The second characteristic of networks is the structure. This includes the position of actors and their ties to others. And so I like to think of this as how the relationships in a network tend to be mapped out. That is, who is central to the network, who tends to be on the periphery, how dense is an individual's network, that is, how extensive is the contact to others. And network density tends to be associated with greater support and solidarity. And then finally, for network composition, studies tend to look at the extent of diversity amongst faculty networks. Having diverse network ties should provide access to unique perspectives and information, but the theory of homophily argues that people are attracted to similar others and that homophily can facilitate trust, communication, and reciprocity. So as a reminder, my first research question is, are there intersectional gender differences in faculty network characteristics? In other words, how do faculty networks compare along the lines of gender and race and those intersections? And so this meta-analysis suggests that there are three primary ways in which faculty networks are gendered to disadvantage women in STEM. So first, women scientists tend to have smaller networks than their male counterparts. They also tend to be more disconnected from the most central actors in research networks as compared to men. And then finally, both men and women scientists tend to have homophilous networks. But for women, their gender homophilous networks are negatively associated with organizational status, and thus provide them with lesser quality information and resources. So I'm going to briefly elaborate on each of these three findings. So women scientists have smaller networks than their male counterparts. This is a measure of size, and this there are a handful of studies I want to point out that find no gender differences in the number of collaboration partners that faculty have. But most in this meta-analysis of the 100 papers I'm working with are pointing to a general pattern of women having smaller collaboration networks compared to men. And so smaller networks are associated with fewer resources that contribute to faculty career growth and advancement, such as opportunities for co-authorship, funding, and job information. Next, the structure of women and men's networks. So women STEM faculty tend to be more disconnected from the central actors in research exchange networks as compared to men. So centrality refers to the position or the location of an individual within an institutional network, with centrally located individuals tending to obtain information more quickly, as well as having more opportunities to control the flow of information across network members. So another way to think of central actors is as the stars of the discipline, those high status individuals who experience a continual flow of opportunities and information, and they can sort of determine in which direction that information then flows from there, how quickly that information moves forward beyond them. And in STEM, men are more likely to be these centrally located stars. And then finally, the composition of networks are gendered. Both men and women scientists, as I said, tend to have homophilous networks. But for women, these gender homophilous networks are negatively associated with things like organizational status, power, access to resources. And so this provides them with lesser quality social capital. In STEM, both gender and ethno-racial homophily especially creates career disadvantages for women and faculty of color because they're often tokens in white male-dominated departments and disciplines. So for example, women's less diverse networks contribute to their difficulty securing research grants and funding relative to men. Gender network differences also contribute to women's poor returns on mentorship and consequent biased information. However, feminist scholarship also points to the emotional, supportive, or intrinsic benefits to be gained from women networking with other women. I think this is really important to point out, including having a woman mentor. So looking beyond just those instrumental benefits that I talked about and considering the more expressive or emotional affective forms of social capital is also important to fully grasp the picture of what's happening. Another group of literature here looks at the various networking strategies that men and women engage in. And this is often defined in the research as individuals' propensity to collaborate. And that's kind of a mouthful. But studies examine who is more or less likely to engage in collaborative behaviors and work with other people. So this research is more mixed. It's also still developing, but a recent study by Italian scholar Giovanni Abramo, who's one of the leaders in this area of research, and his colleagues find no significant gender differences in the overall propensity to collaborate in a sample of Italian academics, except for a few exceptions here. In the case of international collaborations, men demonstrate a greater propensity to engage in international collaborations than women, suggesting that women's networks tend to be more national or domestic based, and also that women tend to have a greater propensity to engage in domestic collaborations with colleagues outside of their own institutions, which is quite an intriguing finding. So something's happening in their home institutions that's forcing or causing women to want to engage outside of their own colleges and universities. And so I think what's important to recognize here is that both men and women are practicing gender as they are networking. While they enter, build, maintain, leverage ties with their professional relationships, we can think of Weston Zimmerman's theory of doing gender as being relevant and important here. And in my own research on high-tech workers and other projects, I suggest that workers are actively doing gender as they network, and that these gender networking strategies are contributing to our homophilous networks, creating these differential career opportunities and further alienating the most marginalized groups of workers in STEM. And so examining networking and gender as intertwining social practices may help to illuminate the subtle exclusionary potential of networking. And so this is an area that really stands to be further developed. So where does race come into all of this? And from an intersectional perspective, there is really a lot less research looking at race and faculty networks in STEM. But a handful of important studies examine these intersections and how they shape faculty experiences. So as I've said now, women of color faculty, the research shows, tend to be the most marginalized group in academia, facing isolation and exclusion from opportunities that are afforded to both their white and male counterparts. And underrepresented racial minority scientists are often excluded from professional networks that are particularly those high value networks that are related to productivity. And for those academics that are here in the audience, we know productivity is key to career advancement, promotion, and tenure opportunities. So members of racially underrepresented groups are more likely to have smaller networks that comprise of lower status and homophilous ties. And they tend to not be part of these more general collegial groups and networks. There's many stories of isolation, being left out from social and professional functions. And so these unwelcoming local climates may result in these smaller networks for minority faculty, resulting in fewer ties in their proximal locations, in their home departments, and their home institutions, as well as low levels of advice resources compared to their white colleagues. So exclusion from networks is frequently cited in the research as being part of the chilly climate and discrimination experienced by faculty of color. However, there is some important research that is hopeful here too, that importantly suggests that Black women faculty in particular are strategically using their gender and racially homophilous networks for career support. Black women faculty, for example, are the most likely of any group to maintain strong relationships with advisors and mentors from their former campuses, and they tend to strategically form and find networks with other Black women faculty through professional associations and online communities. And this is for both personal and research support. So again, instrumental and expressive ties. One study also finds that women of color prefer communal and group-based sources of support rather than this traditional paradigm of individual mentoring where a senior person advises a junior faculty member. They seek out communities that support their research, providing intellectual support, but also career advice. So this research suggests that Black women rely on gender and racially homophilous networks for support, but research must also consider the potential downside of these strategies. So one study, for example, finds that these homophilous networks and collaborations are associated with lower publication productivity and impact. So taken together, these factors signal the importance of looking within gender groups, within racial groups, for these variations that are happening intersectionally, that we can't make assumptions about all women faculty networking in similar ways. And so I argue we really need more research here. Future research should center the experience of women of color faculty in STEM and intentionally look across these intersectional lines. Okay. So the second question is really the so what question. Can these differences, these three patterns that I've pointed to in faculty networks, explain gender variations, racial variations in faculty career outcomes, including productivity, retention, and advancement? So what are the consequences here? And so findings reveal, and this is perhaps unsurprising to many of us, that networks provide a whole host of resources to faculty in STEM. Indeed, some are arguing that they are crucial for success and they provide social capital in the forms of jobs, getting people employment, providing them information about jobs, formally or informally, productivity opportunities that I've mentioned now, visibility and prestige, industry and government connections, which are very important in some STEM fields, financial resources, advice, friendship, and the exchange of ideas, not only on research, but also on teaching, how to manage service expectations, work-life balance. So really a range here. And so I think while this is probably not surprising to many of us, it's really important to justify the continued study of social networks. Networks matter, and they matter a lot in shaping the careers of academics in STEM. So today I've discussed the findings from my meta-analysis research project on gender, race, and networks, focusing specifically on faculty in STEM fields. And so I'd like to now offer some concluding thoughts, as well as point to some remaining questions I have after completing this analysis, as well as directions for future research before I open it up to your questions and more of a discussion. So this meta-analysis has identified structural barriers to women and minority faculty's inclusion in networks. Findings reveal that networks provide a range of key resources. However, women, and especially women of color, remain marginalized despite institutional efforts happening across the country surrounding diversity and inclusion. So focusing on the network size, structure, and composition, I've pointed to 3 mechanisms contributing to the reproduction of inequalities in STEM, but also higher education more broadly. And so this project contributes to the ever-increasing evidence that exclusion from networks can in part contribute to the underrepresentation of women and minorities in STEM. Now, networking is often celebrated as an individual strategy to overcome larger structural gender and racial inequalities in the labor market, particularly for women working in male-dominated fields. We are all told to network, right? As individuals, we can overcome the barriers facing us. And so we hear this again and again, that to get an academic tenure track job, to get the postdoc, to earn promotion, and eventually tenure, that networks are essential. And in some STEM disciplines, there are examples of institutional interventions aimed at building women's networks, often through formal mentoring programs or professional groups. So for example, the Earth Science Women's Network is a grassroots mentoring organization for women working in the atmospheric sciences. And many advanced institutional transformation projects funded by the National Science Foundation include interventions specifically related to faculty networks, mentorship, and collaboration as part of their larger projects aimed to create organizational change surrounding gender equity. So as such, this project is especially timely as networking and mentoring programs are increasingly used as anti-discrimination measures, part of a plethora of diversity management programs to counter the social isolation of women and minorities. Yet these efforts may inadvertently reproduce the gender division of labor in STEM fields, as they are often run and organized by a handful of senior women. Additionally, some studies find that women experience negative repercussions when they form their own networks, as their male colleagues may actively delegitimize these networks. So understanding the paradoxical effects of networking as diversity management, of networking as an individualized strategy to these structural problems is really critical, not just for us to understand, but also for organizations and policymakers seeking to improve gender equity in STEM. This synthesis of the literature on gender and networks also serves as a necessary bridge between the subfields currently engaging in this topic. So I've linked studies engaging in social network theory with sociological research on gendered organizations in STEM as well. And so I suggest that it's especially important for us to develop a mutual understanding or working definition of networks in order to design effective change efforts and to support women faculty as they seek to strengthen their network ties. How change efforts are designed will relate directly to how networks are defined in the academic community. And our understandings of gender inequalities in academic STEM disciplines would be further strengthened through continued integration of these bodies of research. And so as I continue this project, I will seek to bridge scholarship with an eye towards feminist institutional change. And I look forward to collaborating with some of you, members of the ARC network, the Association for Women in Science, maybe in just under a month at the Cleveland convening, to begin to apply these research findings into actionable change efforts. And so thank you very much, and I am looking forward to all of your questions. And so just as a reminder, your questions, you can type them in, and Rochelle, I believe, is going to facilitate for me.
Yes, so thank you so much, Dr. Mickey, for that presentation. We are going to now open it up for question and answer. To ask questions, we're asking that you place them in the chat box. We do have a few, so I'll go ahead and start with those who have already asked questions. What I will do is call your name, and then you can actually unmute yourself. So I don't have to read the question for you. Feel free to ask your own question. So first, we will begin with Maria Bryant.
Maria still here?
Still here. Well, I will say that her comment in the box was women in STEM, which women? So we were trying to determine if your question had been answered, Maria. She said yes, her question's been answered. Great. So now we have a question from Dr. Duda Shrabasti. Please forgive me if I pronounce your name incorrectly.
Hi, Rochelle. This is Sra. No, you have pronounced my name perfectly, actually. Thank you. My first question was, do you think that we women are a little bit responsible for not having a network? Because sometimes I see that we women compete against other women much more than we do with men, or I see that female students preferring male professors over female professors. Thanks.
Thank you. No, that's a great question. And, I think the tricky thing about homophily is that we all are comfortable being around people who share our backgrounds, who share our identities and experiences. And so it's very easy to fall into sort of this trap where women network with women, men with men, white people with white people, and so on and so forth. But with that being said, I do really believe this is a structural issue. If we think about even the numbers of women in departments, STEM departments, in colleges and universities, when you're outnumbered and you tend to be tokens in your environment, there are not many folks that you can turn to that have those shared experiences. And so I really think that this is more of an issue that we can change from the top down. Another thing to note is in my research on STEM workers outside of academia is that really across the board, people find networking to be really uncomfortable. It's awkward. There's things about it, like, for example, it being centered around alcohol a lot of the times, that men and women find to be problematic. And so I don't think it's the case that men are putting themselves out there more or engaging in networking in ways that are maybe more aggressive than women. And so it's just a matter of creating opportunities and spaces where these ties across these lines of difference can happen. And I think that's where some of these institutional interventions are being designed with that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you.
Also, Dr. Duda asked if you have papers that you can make available to them. I will say that we have placed your final report that basically summarizes this presentation on equityinstem.org. So feel free to access her final report there too.
Yes, and thank you, Rochelle. And my website is just my name, ethelmickey.com, and there are links to all my publications there. And if you don't have institutional access, just shoot me an email. I'd be happy to share.
Our next question goes to Dr. Pat Marsteller. Again, forgive me if I've pronounced your name incorrectly. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
No, I was actually just trying to say that there are some other organizations and granting agencies that support building these kinds of networks, like the Hannah Gray Fellowships and like the advanced grants from NSF, and that they have lots and lots of resources for what kinds of things we need to do to make institutional change. So it was really more of a comment than a question.
That's great, and I think there are some really important things happening, and there's no way I could list them all in a short presentation, but I think even within the advanced IT institutions, networks and collaboration seems to be built into a lot of the institutional change efforts, and it's really exciting to see. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question goes to Dr. Robin Stevens. Please unmute your microphone.
Hi, my Hi. My
Hello.
question is about women's networks. I work at a university. I'm a associate professor, and I do basic research. And I've founded a bunch of networking kind of clubs. We call them mentoring circles. But it really struck a harmonic in my brain when you said that homophilic networks don't necessarily translate to professional advancement, let's say, or productivity and scientific interactions, right? And one of the issues there is that women at the university on average are less advanced. You know, we're just climbing now, right? And so I made great network. I know a lot of people, but I didn't necessarily get as far as I would if one senior man had reached out to pull me up, right? So, so what I've done is extend that female collaborative network across the country and the world to try to sort of build strength in numbers. So each person has their specialty, and then we collaborate to make a bigger project based on each one of our specialties, right? So that's also not the perfect solution, because those senior men who run the fields have us in their grips, right? So I think the question is, if you, from your research, have identified, and maybe you said this, I tuned in a bit late, but also probably it's hard to articulate, or maybe it's not known, how to form networks that do add to productivity, that do provide career advancement opportunities, or whatever you get for mentoring, a little bit better than the homophilic approach.
Good. And so thank you. You're pointing to sort of all of this feminist research that looks at universities as gendered organizations, where the hierarchy of organizations is extremely gendered, and there's segregation both sort of horizontally but also vertically, and with women being predominantly in humanities and social sciences, not as much STEM. And I think it's interesting, right? They're outnumbered, and so to try to, it's important to have support networks and to have some homophily, but then also to have people who have power and status in institutions as part of your networks can be extremely beneficial as well. And right now that's men, right? And I think what you're talking about in the network you're building also speaks to the pattern that women tend to look outside of their home institutions to build their networks. And so thinking about ways to do that creatively, you know, I hear a lot, and this is not necessarily from the meta-analysis, but from other research, that women get frustrated with the content of networking and mentoring programs, that it's not as hands-on and directly related to providing strategic co-authorship opportunities or exchange of skills. And you know, a lot of times it could be centered around work-life balance, as I think you just alluded to, or more soft topics.
Children.
Yes, right, exactly.
And writing skills, like I wouldn't be here if I didn't have writing skills.
Yes, and so there is a tendency, and I think, you know, this isn't across the board by any means, that there are some great institutional change efforts happening, but this tendency to focus on these soft skills, or, you know, teaching women how to negotiate, which is important, but that doesn't lead to productivity necessarily. And so I think recentering the purpose or the mission of networking groups, or redefining what mentoring looks like could be really important. I guess it goes back to this question of, like, what do we mean by networks? Who do we include in that? And what specific resources are we looking to gain?
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Stevens, for that question. Now we'll turn it over to Dr. Rosa Cabrera. Please unmute your microphone. Okay, maybe she's exited. I will say that her question was, what about women of color who have disabilities or women with disabilities in STEM/tech?
It's a great question. And, you know, I'll say that there was really no research that I found in my meta-analysis looking at networks that looked at the intersection of gender and disability. Disability studies, I think, is a really exciting burgeoning subfield of sociology, and there's work to be done here when we're thinking about who are the most marginalized groups of faculty. I think looking at what the research is covering can also point us in the direction of who's being excluded from these sort of networking groups as well. I know some of the advanced IT programming have created support networks, not just for women, but for LGBTQ faculty, for faculty from international backgrounds. And so there's support needed across these lines of privilege and identity.
Thank you. The next question from Dr. Teresa Freeman. Please feel free to unmute your microphone.
I think my question was answered in part by the previous person that was asking the question, but basically it's the same thing, which is we have a majority of men, a minority of women. The men are at the top. You can form a network, but it's very difficult to penetrate, especially even at the department level, at every level. So that I just was wondering if there are any ways that you could give some examples of what to do instead of just to identify the problem.
No, I think that's a great question, and it's part of sort of the next steps for this project is now that we know what the problems are, what can we change at and create toolkits for not just for departments and universities, but also for individuals to use. And so I really think that it will require sort of multi-level efforts, providing not just educational resources like webinars and workshops, but some real structural change as well, implementing, you know, formalized mentoring programs for junior faculty, formalizing some of those support groups that I just mentioned. And so, you know, I think that we still have a long way to go in thinking about these interventions happening, so that the onus is not on the individual woman, the individual faculty member to go out and seek out those network ties, because we all have a million things going on, a million responsibilities, and networking, I hear from women a lot, often tends to fall by the wayside because it's just the last thing on the list. It should be done, but it's not a necessary thing to be done. And so how can we flip that? How can the senior people in these spaces of higher education start to support that? And, you know, if anyone here has interventions at their institutions or their organizations that they wanted to share as part of sort of best practices, I'd be happy to sort of open up the conversation and hear what else is happening.
And it seems like that like you said, it's going to take a century to make these changes unless something really happens at the institutional level. And it seems like we're talking around it and around it. The institution has these, you know, women groups, and who goes? The women all go and not the men. And I've been to 3 or 4 in a row, and it's just like, I'm not the one that should be getting talked to about this. You know, it's an institutional problem. So I think if there was I think women would get together and do and approach the administration, but we need a solid, like, this works, do it now, you know, kind of a plan.
Yes, and you know, I think you mentioning sort of like meeting men in the room is really important, and a few advanced programs have started to incorporate allied programs where men are, you know, they interview and apply to be allies to women in STEM on their campus, and there's research coming out that's sort of evaluating how those work. There's research that shows that maybe men experience some career benefits for doing this that aren't necessarily benefiting us as women. And so that's problematic too. So really thinking about, there's the beauty is that the National Science Foundation and Advance, the program, there's a lot of resources being dedicated to this. There's a commitment that's happening to prevent this from taking a century long. And so it's a matter of creating the right and designing the right interventions to be the most effective, for sure.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Rachel Roper, please unmute your microphone.
Hi, yeah, thanks. So one of the things that I've noticed is that I didn't believe there was gender bias anymore, and most of my male colleagues don't believe there's gender bias. And unless you're in, sociology, you don't know the data on gender bias. So we have these, trainings that, the Office for Equity and Diversity sends out and invites people to bias trainings, but nobody believes that there is bias, so they don't go to them, or only the women who already know about bias go to them. So this is the reason. And the other thing is there's a lot of claims or, women complaining, but without the actual data to prove that there really is bias. So this is the reason. I just wrote a review article on this, and luckily it got accepted to a top journal, and I did post it in the chats over there to actually show people that there is real data that proves that there's gender bias today across, in faculty and in students, and people don't know it. And if they don't know it, they're not going to go to the equity training, right? So just raising awareness that there is gender bias is so important. And I gave a talk on this at the American Society for Virology. I gave it a talk at my poxvirus conference. It's been very well received. And I think that's like the first basic underlying thing. We have to let all faculty know that gender bias occurs today. And it's in students and it's in faculty, even though we've had these trainings. So so I hope, and I'm happy to come give a seminar anywhere. And please, look at the paper. I'll post it again. I think the work you're doing is great and really important, and we need to get the information out there that there really is bias, and to do it in a way that's not man-hating. I'm very careful when I give talks about, because most of the data show that both men and women are biased against women. So we've just got to get that information out there. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the work that you're doing. And absolutely, the baseline sort of acknowledgement that bias and discrimination and stereotyping all exist, and they especially exist in fields that have been traditionally male-dominated, white spaces, is definitely important. And before we can move on to thinking about interventions, we need buy-in. And the idea of implicit bias is especially interesting. This idea has really taken off as something that is palatable to people in power, to men. They seem to, because it's implicit, they don't have to take ownership of it, or that we all have it. And so then what do we do? And so I'm curious to see sort of what the next steps are once we recognize that implicit bias exists. How do we get people to act on it? But I'm really excited to read your article, and thanks for sharing it.
Thanks.
Thank you. Unfortunately, due to time, that was our last question. At this moment, I'm going to turn it over to the PI of the ARC Network grant, Heather Metcalf.
Thanks everyone for coming to this wonderful webinar and hearing about Ethel's work. It's really fantastic, and clearly we have a lot that we can continue to talk about on this particular topic. From systemic change to survival strategies for people who are wanting to broaden their own networks. There's a lot. And so what we'll do is we've recorded the webinar, and we'll be sharing out the recording after concluding this. And we'll take a lot of these resources that you all were so generous in sharing in the chat box as part of our discussion, and share that back out with you so it's easier to access afterwards. I also invite you all to, if you want to hear more from Ethel, reach out directly to her. Her email address is up here on the screen. And if you'd like to hear her talk about this in person alongside our other virtual visiting scholar who's going to be presenting via webinar in a couple of weeks, They'll be in person in Cleveland at our Equity and STEM community convening in October, and you can look at the information about that on equityandstem.org. The website's also up here, and you can register to attend that and gather a lot of resources, have more great conversations like this, and connect with other colleagues at that convening, as I mentioned, in October. So thank you all so much for coming and for being so engaging.